Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast. Today's episode, top mistakes that ruin growth when scaling an IT and services business. Studies show that nearly 70% of scaling IT firms stall or fail within 5 years. Not because lack of demand, but because of internal missteps in how they grow. I'm Greg Rabine, and I help IT technology solution providers scale with AI-powered systems so they can grow revenue predictably. Growth in IT and services is often seen as a sign of success, but too many companies discover that rapid growth can be just as dangerous as being stagnant. Studies show that a majority of firms that fail during scaling don't lose because of market competition. They trip over their own internal mishaps, such as weak systems, misaligned teams, and short-term fixes that collapse under pressure. For these reasons, I'm very excited to introduce today's guest, Noah Landow, founder and CEO of Macktez, and we'll be cutting through the noise to uncover mistakes that ruin growth when scaling an IT and services business, and more importantly, how to avoid them. So before I turn the mic over to Noah, I'll just run through our flow for this afternoon. So we'll start out having Noah introduce himself and tell us about his background, experience, and journey. And then we'll explore trends Noah is seeing in the industry, and we'll talk about opportunities and challenges. And then we'll wrap up with Noah's thoughts on where things are heading. So, Noah, pleased to meet you, and thanks so much for joining my podcast today.
Great to meet you as well, Gregory. Thank you for having me here. Exciting to talk a little bit about some of these topics. These are, I think, a set of topics that are probably on the mind of everybody who's running a technology company, certainly running a technology services company, and something I spent a lot of time thinking and talking about. My background, just for reference, is I actually did architecture before I did technology. I started Macktez with a group of collaborators, including my current business partner, back in the mid-90s, 1996, 1997. And technology consulting was extremely different, extraordinarily different as a landscape. Most of our clients were small creative companies. We were sort of Macintosh centric. It was before iPhone, before a mobile device was really a thing. Laptops weren't even really a thing right at the beginning there. Technology is really the way we experience, the way we use technology is so different from those early days. One of my funny stories from that first 6 months was installing a mail server and having a marketing director who sort of came up to me while I was setting up this mail server and being like, "What is this thing? I'm never going to use this thing. This is a waste of time. I don't know why. I'm going to fax things and I'm going to use messengers. Like there's just no, this does not need to exist." And then less than 6 weeks later, calling me on a Sunday night, panicked that an email hadn't gone out that was critical for a competition they were entering the very next day. So I feel like, sometimes it feels like the technology landscape we're in is sort of this breakneck pace where like every few months you look around and you're like, well, that's different now. But it's nice to be reminded that it's always felt like that. That sort of state of change is a constant that has been with us for at least 30 years, probably longer. So a little bit about Macktez. Macktez is about a small, about 20-person consultancy. We kind of are a mix of sort of an MSP and a technology consultancy. A lot of what we do is work with sort of value-driven organizations that are going through some period of a lot of change. So they're often nonprofits. One of our high-profile clients is Little Island, which is a park on the west side of Manhattan. Amazing, beautiful park. We worked with them from the construction phase. A lot of our work with them was trying to sort of help bring a bunch of different technology vendors together, mediate and translate. Hey, this box that you've spec'd is not big enough for the piece of equipment that you said you needed. We need to find a different piece of equipment that does what that guy says he needs and that guy says he needs, but meets this requirements from the fire department. So a lot of what we do is sort of end up sort of figuring out how to untangle these sort of spaghetti piles of competing challenges. And then that often translates into sort of working with those companies ongoing as sort of an MSP, as an ongoing kind of outsourced IT. We also work a lot with much larger organizations. And these larger organizations, MakerBot was an example of one of those from past years, where we work co-managing their technology technology stacks with them, often helping them train up, change infrastructure, do office moves, essentially augmenting and assisting, sometimes at a very high level, sometimes sort of taking the place of a CTO or even a CISO, and sometimes working with a whole sort of different series of groups in order to translate what in this day and age is often migrations to cloud-centric or sort of remote-first technologies. Directories and workstation management are a lot of what we spend our time doing these days.
Nice. So you're working on City Island. I love City Island. Diane von Fosterberg and I can't remember her husband's name, but
Yes, Barry. Yeah, Barry and Diane, they're wonderful. She's fantastic. I know her through a summer camp that I have been involved with for many years called Bucks Rock as well, that her granddaughter runs. So she's
oh,
lovely.
yeah, that's awesome. So I mean, many firms rush to growth without a clear technology or operation strategy. What are the warning signs a business is scaling too quickly or scaling in the wrong way?
For us, I think I mean, of course, we've been around long enough that I can say without revealing any great mysteries or surprises that we've made missteps, many missteps over the course of the years. Um, I think the kinds of challenges that we encountered that I think many people encounter is trying to align your kind of resource and your capacity so that when projects come in, you have enough excess capacity to manage those effectively, but also you don't have so much excess capacity that you're basically just burning through cash because people are sitting around doing nothing. Also, it's not terribly pleasant for team members to be sitting around doing nothing. So trying to find that balance act, particularly at the small scale, I think is one of the great conundrums and great challenges of an MSP.
Yeah, I, I guess I refer to it as the paperwork trap, but it seems like many IT and services businesses scale by adding headcount, but they keep relying on manual processes. And I just remember this from sales, and being in sales, like a startup, they, you know, they, I'm just going to make these numbers up, but the board and they've determined that they want to, scale to 10 million in, you know, 18 months. So they hire, a bunch of sales guys and give them $1 million quota and think that that's how they're going to do it. And that is obviously the wrong approach.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're in an extremely interesting moment in time from a business, from a finance, from a employment perspective. Um, and by that, I don't necessarily mean AI, although I think AI is sort of a larger hype cycle topic that does impinge upon this and affect this. I think part of this is about SaaS products, what I call consumerification of technology. And I think part of this is also about interoperability between those platforms. So um, all that is to say, whether you're a small design firm or a nonprofit or any number of different organizations under 50 people these days, most of the time, the core technologies that you need to successfully do your basic business stuff is really about giving a credit card to Microsoft or Google or some other company, going up to Apple or Dell or Lenovo, buying a bunch of machines and kind of plugging those things in. And most of that stuff actually works relatively well. Frankly, for a group under 20 or 30 people, in many cases it works really well. Um, Especially if you're starting from scratch now. The hardest thing is actually if you have done a bunch of things and then had a series of changes and then have to sort of untangle the mess that you're left with. We talk about like taming the beast, that technology becomes a beast because you've built something that does something and then changing it to do something else is a frankly a more complicated challenge. It's like it's the whole joke about trying to do Achilles tendon surgery on a runner who's still running. Like a lot of technology services work that we do is really a version of that. But despite this sort of stack of technology products, companies like ours are sitting in between some very interesting trend lines and some very interesting phenomena. Examples of that are the PSAs or the professional services kind of like products and services that are rolling in a bunch of these remote managed tool stacks so that you end up with like a Microsoft Entra and an Okta and a device management tool and a patch management tool and a network monitoring and there's an incredible I would say explosion of different types of offerings that overlap and sort of connect to each other in this sort of like software product space. And those are both very exciting. It means that tons of things actually work incredibly well in a way that they did not work well 5, 10, 15 years ago. But it also is very tricky for an organization who's not 1,000 people. You're not large enough to sort of command control over what happens. Also, a large amount of the way that landscape works is dictated by PE and venture capital funds. So it's like which PE group is doing a roll up with which combination of products, and which backup tool that you really love that your team thought was awesome got bought by this company and now isn't being offered anymore, or doesn't work the same way, or is 5 times more expensive. So it's a very interesting landscape. That sea is it's very easy to get buffeted by some of the basically the things outside of your control. And on the other side of that, I think we were also in a very interesting space where expectations from end users have shifted over the last 10 or 20 years. The idea of what expectation there is in place for end user support. We get requests more and more for like, oh, can I just like Slack somebody to do all this stuff? And, can I Slack them at 4 in the morning? And there's some very interesting challenges and opportunities in the messaging around what that means and how that works, and what the systems that have to be in place to make those kinds of things work, what those look like, and what effect those have. We don't tend to do that kind of thing, by the way. We tend to be like, hey, let's pull that stuff out. If that's what you want, you should have an in-house person. Let's train them up and have them on the schedule that your executives want, or have 2 people at different shifts. But figuring out how to solve and design some of those is, I think, a very interesting space that is just dramatically different than it was a decade ago. Also, a bunch of underlying tech is different. The way data segmentation models work on the iOS devices now is dramatically different than they were, 10 years ago. So there's a whole set of new BYOD possibilities that just didn't work before, even zero touch. So.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, you touched on some great topics, but the one thing that we didn't touch on here yet, anyway, the compliance as a growth killer. So
Mhm.
certainly financial services firms, I should say, or even medical or healthcare firms often underestimate compliance until it becomes
Mhm.
a bottleneck. So what are
Yeah.
the biggest compliance missteps you see growing firms make?
That's an interesting question. I think much bigger than compliance, I would say, would be security. I think compliance is arguably kind of a regulator saying you're going to have to do these things for this data protection, security slash segmentation reasons. And in my early days, we ended up doing a lot of Sarbanes-Oxley compliance. We had a bunch of design firms that were part of like Publicis and Omnicom and rollups. And then as part of those rollups, they became obliged to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley. And in many ways, a lot of compliance still exists in this space where it's hitting tick marks. You're checking a bunch of kind of things, or like, do we have a policy? Yes or no? Is that a good policy for this organization? Is not the point. The point of these compliance frameworks is to have sort of like, a level playing field. Um, I do feel like there's a bunch of interesting products. I think Vanta is one. There's a number of really interesting organizations now that are doing some automation in that space. Exactly how good or bad those are, I think, depends a lot on your industry and, frankly, the scale and cost involved. But the areas that I think are most interesting for that are actually more about cybersecurity in general. Examples of that are multi-factor and identity, central identity, single sign-on. Those are, for most organizations, the first compliance requirement that they have is coming, we find, from either a parent company or from an insurance provider. And it's typically widespread and consistent multi-factor on critical accounts. That's probably so commonplace as to almost go without saying. But we still encounter that a lot. We still encounter organizations that we're first starting to work with that are like, oh, it's not consistent, it's not enforced, it's not logged. And that's an area where identity platforms like Jump Cloud, which we use a great deal, we're doing actually a new event with Jump Cloud tonight, in our office in the East Village. That's an area where I think there's some really interesting stuff happening, where things that were extremely complicated and time consuming, trying to do your own Duo, Okta, legacy .NET sort of rollout versus doing something with like a clean system like Jump Cloud that's fully integrated and contains an agent on the machine, so you can have multi-factor on Mac OS and Windows laptops, like on the actual device, even when they're offline. So some really interesting stuff I think that's happening in that kind of space for multi-factor. Again, it's a bit of a low bar. It's the lowest bar, but I do think that's an area where organizations miss that as a baseline requirement when they're smaller. It's obviously much easier to implement that kind of thing when you're 5 people or 50 people than to try to go ahead and kind of enforce that at 100 or larger.
No, understand. You got to build the foundation correctly, and that's the only way it'll work. But now, the big opportunity, but big challenge, right? AI. I guess it would be interesting to hear your perspective on how organizations can align their AI ambitions with the reality of governance, compliance, and risk management. But not only, you know, uh, governance and risk management, but also shadow IT. So in other words, you have users and they're using their PC, and why wouldn't they use ChatGPT at work when they're using it at home? So and so that brings up a lot of challenges around data privacy and your private data being out there in the cloud now.
Yeah, I think that there's a few different layers to that. Microsoft had a much discussed kind of rollout of Copilot being like default on and essentially capturing all interactions with your machine. They've sort of rolled back on that, shifted sort of positions exactly about how they're doing that. Number of web browsers, of course, have a similar thing where their whole idea is they're essentially capturing your entire end user experience. Ultimately, I think it's too soon to know what the implications of some of those things are, because there is a very large distance between where the things that we call AI, between where they intend to go and where they are now. A lot of the AI products right now are kind of this like alpha pre. They're not even working right. So they're not yet at a space where you're like, oh, this is a product that's like fully baked. It's been launched. It's done. It's basically being launched during this sort of like semi-functional early stage. There is some great AI driven products out there. I mean, I like to joke when talking to people that are non-technical that it's like you're using AI. You have an iPhone keyboard from 10, 20 years ago, which is machine learning based. Like the whole thing that works is the same underlying technology. It's just not generative AI, but it's still AI. It's still sort of the same idea of these sort of business logic and this machine learning technologies that are used and have been used in an enormous range of. You use Netflix, the recommendation engine was machine learning for decades now. So the idea that sort of AI is sort of a brand new thing is missing, I think, sort of the larger history and but at the same time, what we're expecting and the anticipation of what AI is capable of doing right now is extremely. There's a lot of hype, and I think there's a lot of promises in figuring out kind of which of those actually get delivered. I'm sure, like you, I spend not a small amount of my time pulling up tools and being like, "Oh, this is an interesting." You and I had a brief conversation about Riverside earlier. I've used CapCut and a bunch of other products that are designed to, for example, optimize interviews. I do a lot of interviews as well, pulling those interviews into something and actually generating kind of like a rough cut first pass. And I have to say, many of them are laughably bad. Some of them are quite good, but the variability is very high in terms of like the source material and the content. And also your expectation. It's like, are you trying, you expect this tool to deliver results equivalent to sort of your, minimum wage, barely paid intern who is just out of school but really confident? Or are you expecting them to sort of compare to a professional who's actually quite good? And I think a lot of the tools in this space now exist in this sort of management layer where you need to be an effective manager to manage the tool. You need to understand how you define what success would look like. You need to have some sort of like an understanding of like what the check back framework is, and you need to also have an ability to evaluate whether you succeeded or not. So those are, I think, a critical component. And I think that's obviously a big part of compliance is understanding those are often set for you, but understanding what those criteria are and how those apply to the tools you're evaluating.
Understand. So underestimating the human factor. So it's just not about systems, right? And you mentioned, personnel on your earlier comment, but it's just not about systems. It's about people and habits. So how do staffing decisions, culture, or lack of client education undermine scaling efforts?
That's interesting. Not exactly a scaling issue, but I think this comes up in the context of when we've encountered significant security incidents. They've often been the result of phishing, often specifically spear phishing. And it's often somebody quite senior at the organization who would be the kind of person who was probably exempted from some of the compliance requirements from a perspective of like, oh, maybe we can disable, they still have a BlackBerry, so we're going to leave on this legacy support. So there is an interesting challenge there of when you're beginning to think about how to approach those security challenges while at the same time ensuring that the people are sufficiently suspicious of the kind of things that can't fully be protected. for example, there's a limit to how well you can fully protect people from phishing emails. At some point, you need your humans in your organization to have their hackles raised and to be nervous and suspicious when they see something that's like, why is this video that I don't know who it's from? Why is that asking me to sign into Google? That seems weird. Like you want to make sure that people have that moment when they're like, wait a minute, this is not what I expected to happen. And I've been extremely impressed, frankly, over the last few years on how wide ranges of people have gotten better and better at that. My mother, for example, is incredibly better. She's in her 80s, and it's like she is like, I got to click on a link, but it doesn't seem right, so I just closed it. And I feel like I see that and hear about that more and more from clients and other environments.
No, that's so true. If you don't recognize it or you don't know it, delete, block
Yeah.
right away.
Exactly. Call out of band if it's important. If you really think that person was somebody who somebody really wanted to send money to, pick up the phone and talk to the person who asked you.
Exactly. They'll
Definitely.
find you.
Yeah.
So, well, scaling the client experience now. I mean,
Yeah.
not only internally, your internal employees, but your customers, your outside your firewall customers, partners,
Freelancers. Yeah.
freelancers. So growth often creates a trade-off between speed and quality of client experience, right?
Hmm.
And I'll always remember, going into like an executive office on Wall Street, and do I get it faster? Do I get it faster? That's always their question. Faster, 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 faster. So how can firms scale their back office without losing that personal touch with clients? And how does Macktez provide guidance around this?
Interesting question. I think it's very case by case. I wish I had a more of a like one button press answer. I think some of it is things take time. We have taken pride for many years and like, hold on, slow down. We do have clients that are like, can I have it tomorrow? And it's like, no, you cannot have it tomorrow. So part of it is seeing yourself as sort of, uh, you know, responsibility to the security, to the larger strategic business purpose, not the kind of knee-jerk desire to just like spend $1 and get it tomorrow, but instead be like, hey, this is a process that takes 6 months. Like you're not going to find this experience is worthwhile if you rush it. Like you have people internally who are going to have to buy into this process, and if you want them to buy in, you need to give them time to come along the journey with you and with us. So some of it is slowing down. Internally, I think we have prioritized over the years a recognition that you bring on team members and they need time to support each other and acclimate. It is always, I think, an interesting tension in that technology, particularly in the sort of the IT and MSP space, tends to be the kind of world where people move from job to job relatively quickly. I think turnover has been a big part. We do have a number of people on our team that have been with us for 10 years, 13 years, 23 years. So we're unusual in how long people have kind of been on our team. Uh, but one of the interesting things, one of the challenges that happens in these sort of turnover environments is that the technologies are constantly changing, and also the people, to some extent, there's some degree of change, and some of it's people are moving, and we're in New York, so people move in and out of New York, and also it's like you need to provide opportunities for your team to have something that captures their attention, that makes them excited, like what am I doing next? And so, MSP and IT work, I think, are an area where we've been lucky in that the changes in the industry have continuously provided new opportunities. But sometimes people, hopefully graduate and go off and do amazing things, and we're still in touch with lots and lots of former team members for precisely that reason. But as far as the sort of the secret trick, I think, unfortunately, is sort of take it slow, not move fast, and kind of like be methodical, build those kind of relationships and those kind of competencies sort of over time by sort of slow and steady.
Nice. So how do your customers find you?
That's a great question. For many, many years, for our first 20 years, all of our customers were referrals. We actually didn't take clients for many, many years unless they had a referral from an existing client. We've shifted over the years. I would say probably 80 to 90% of our clients still trace back to some sort of referral. But we do a little bit of marketing. We have a tech talk series called Teta Tech. We actually have one tonight on automation, innovations in identity, no, infrastructure as a service, with a gentleman named Edward Weir, who's a sort of IT lead at Masterworks and formerly of WNBA. That's on the Jump Cloud. So we do a series of actually they're in person. They're about 30 people. They're relatively small. We have a lovely office in the East Village, and so we bring people in for kind of a sort of a conversation. They about half an hour, 45 minutes, really, really enjoyable. And it's just like a nice mix of people from some different backgrounds. So we do those. We also have done a lot more work on sort of blog posts and case studies and getting our stuff out there. And then we have a couple of kind of experimental sales outbound processes that are running at any given time.
Do you participate in industry events? You know, Gartner, RSA, ISACA.
We don't had it. We did do. We had a low voltage team that was very active for a number of years in doing security. So we went to a couple of events at Javits over the years. We haven't found that those are as effective. I am involved in a lovely group called Founders Club, which is sort of a SaaS founder centered organization. It's not only SaaS, but a lot of them SaaS and DTC. And so we do consulting in that space. Sometimes we kind of have an opportunity to present itself. But generally speaking, we found a lot of the areas that the people we want to be talking to are really CTOs who have an in-house team and look around and are like, I have a capacity problem or I have a problem I need to solve. Frankly, I think our competition is often professional services teams from a single vendor. We're able to come in and kind of solve a problem across multiple vendors and frankly also unpack a messier situation than a professional services team. But we have some really great clients can't name, where we're kind of untangling a lot of those messes right now, and those are extremely challenging and gratifying.
No, awesome. Now, are your customers and your target ideal customers, are they New York centric, Northeast centric, nationwide, global?
It's a great question. The vast majority of our clients are have some sort of presence in New York. We do have a number of clients that are completely remote. I would say a dozen or so clients of our maybe top 50 are fully remote. Some of those represent clients that were New York centric and moved on. I think it's for us, it's more of a culture fit. I would describe what we do as co-managing, even when we are the entire IT department. For example, even when there isn't a help desk, there isn't a CTO, or there isn't an internally focused CTO. Sometimes we work with organizations like in finance where they have a CTO, but they're really focused on product. They're doing the frequency trading or the quantum work, and we're handling the back end stuff. So in all of those scenarios, we are really co-managing. Sometimes it's the director of operations, sometimes it's a facilities manager, but in all those collaborations, I think we're seeing ourselves as sort of connecting with somebody who has information and insight and visibility into the way that organization works. It's also, I think, a component where some of our clients have a physical location somewhere, but that's not the primary driver of our engagement. More and more of these client environments, even when they are physically in New York, they have people that are scattered around, and the fleet management systems that we're putting in place could be anywhere, not even just in the country, but in the world.
Sure. No, I understand. That's awesome. So, I guess some practical advice for our audience. If you had to give IT and services founders one playbook principle for scaling without falling into these mistakes, what would that be?
I think it would be you have to trust your team as the founder, as the person who literally was the founder initially. I think one of the most common mistakes I have made and probably continue to make sometimes is, oh, I'm just going to do it myself. So I think the one piece of advice that I got many years ago from a CEO, which I think applies really, really well across this entire landscape, is if you're doing the same thing a year or two later, then something's gone wrong. That every 6 months to 2 years, you should be doing something different. And what that means is that you've identified which of these things you were doing somebody else can do probably better and handed them off, or you've stopped doing them and you've explored some new thing. That happens to work well for me because I get a little bit restless if I do the same thing like year after year after year. So for me, a lot of the last 27, 8 years has been like, what thing am I excited to learn about this year? And it's been a different thing each year. So in my case, it's a right temperament for this, but I think it's very important when you are thinking about the sort of like IT and MSP space to be like, make sure you're not kind of basically painting yourself into a corner where you're the most important employee and you do everything yourself.
Wow, yes, that's really great. Well, I mean, I really want to thank you for the truly insightful discussion. You know, your expertise is invaluable for anyone scaling their business. And I mean, what a robust conversation and great advice. So, where can our listeners find you online?
We have a website, macktez.com, Macktez.com. And hopefully in the next few weeks, next month or two, we'll finish a book we've been working on. My business partner and I have been writing a book called Tame the Tech Beast, which is jokingly, half jokingly, maybe not even really jokingly, framed as sort of like we have conversations with potential clients sometimes where uh, part of that conversation is sort of like, oh, I wish I'd known this a year ago. And so we decided at some point to say, let's put together a book that actually codifies some of this conversation so that they can read it a year before we meet and maybe make the right decisions a little bit before we get there, as opposed to waiting until we show up and then being like, well, I wish we hadn't spent that money. If we'd waited, we could have done this thing differently. So that's a book that hopefully will be out soon.
So that's really great. I was going to ask you if you had any resources or special offers you'd like to share. So that sounds like a great offer. So they'll be able to find our audience will be able to find this on your website.
Yep, absolutely. Macktez.com. The link there.
Awesome. That's great. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us. If you found this discussion valuable, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share this episode with anyone who might benefit. You can also visit our website for more resources on scaling your IT services business. So we encourage you to connect with Noah, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. But until next time, stay cyber resilient and keep innovating. Thank you so much, Noah.
Thank you, Gregory, and thank you everybody else for listening.